So, welcome online, welcome on site to our third session on ICSA conference. I will be your room chair. My name is Gary Schween. I think most of you already know me. And I will just hand it over to the three presentations and ask all of them to introduce themselves. We will start with an online presentation from Marquis de Boron, a reflection critique of a coaching program experience in Lac Canada Community. Und, sorry.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I will be sharing with you today. It's still, I would say, it's still a work in progress. I am still involved in a coaching program. I have not named the community itself, but it is a community that is here in Canada. And just so you know, I've been coaching this particular community for about 2 years now. So my name is Marquis, and at the moment, yes, I do coaching, but I'm also involved in as a doctoral candidate in a interdisciplinary research program, PhD program at St. Paul University on contemporary issues. I'm also a part-time faculty member in human relations. And the doctoral research that I will be conducting soon, this fall, at least initiating the project, is with L'Arche Canada, and I'll say a few words about that in a few seconds. And also, I'm also with the St. Paul University on the research team for a center called Echo Visions and another one called in Transformative Leadership. So just to let you know, it's not exactly what I will be talking about specifically today, but it is part of my interest, definitely. My research question at the moment is what are challenges and issues related to engaging and accompaniment of leaders in the intentional communities of L'Arche Canada, and how will funding myths, I did add an S in parentheses because there appears to be more than one, of L'Arche adapt and or transform to ensure the sustainability of the mission and vision within L'Arche Canada and its communities. So there's definitely something happening, right, at L'Arche, and looking at engagement, accompaniment, and also the founding myth, and knowing how thinking about sustainability, in other words, thinking about the transition. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, and it's a two objectives. One is to conduct a diagnosis of leaders and leadership in communities, and also to co-create eventually a program of accompaniment, of which I'm interested in the process, and L'Arche Canada will be interested in the product or the result itself. So today, I'll focus on coaching as a posture of accompaniment for leaders in a Canadian community of L'Arche. Just want to make sure that I start this. I will also take a critical look at the process that we've used, because we are working on developing a particular type of process which can be suitable for an intentional community, and also for an intentional community that has an important spiritual dimension. So I'll talk about that. And I've also included into this exploration an approach called two-eyed seeing. So you'll see that I am interested in the ancient ways of looking at the world and new ways as well. And so I'll what the two-eyed seeing approach helps us to do is to focus on a relational process as opposed to just a rational one, which is sometimes how coaching initiatives are initiated. So l'Arche Internationale and l'Arche Canada, some of you are quite familiar with both. So on the international, l'Arche is a community that is centered around homes, workplaces, and gathering places. So they do have homes, and they do have also people who are living outside the home that are part of the community. So it's each community forms its own network of relationships, open to all its members, both within and without an intellectual disability. So there are about 150 communities worldwide, and what they call 30 projects. So they're not full-fledged standalone communities, but they are in the process of, or they are being funded as a project. In Canada, out of the 150 communities, there are 28, and also two projects. So specifically, l'Arche Canada, its mission is to make known the gifts of people with intellectual disabilities revealed through mutually transforming relationships. So that's one of the big reasons I'm interested in making sure that accompaniment models will reflect this notion of relationship, the fact that it is very much the aim of the community as well. To foster an environment and community that responds to the challenging dreams and needs of its members, while being faithful to the vision and core values of our founding story. And what I am discovering is that it could be founding stories, but that's interesting. I'm sure it's not the first time that happens. Engage in our diverse cultures, working together towards a more human society. So, I started with if coaching is the answer, what's the question? Because sometimes we tend to have answers and forget to ask what the questions are. And basically, as we were going through that particular process, three needs were identified in terms of coaching needs. So the request was very much to support the community leader, and the leadership team. So there are about in this particular community, there are about seven people on the leadership team, and also to engage house leaders and assistants. So house leaders and assistants are the ones living in homes. Leadership team, the team that is supporting the different homes. And this particular community has 5 homes. And one of the sub question that I was thinking about is this an issue where we're dealing with a leadership crisis, or are we dealing with leaders in crisis? And it just happens that in this case, because sometimes it's not always an either or, but sometimes one side is more prevalent than the others. I would say that in this case, yes to a leadership crisis, and yes, a bigger yes, even for leaders in crisis. So of course that does have an impact on how the coaching initiative accompaniment is designed. So I did mention that part of the work, my interests, and part of the work that I do and what I teach was this notion of combining leadership and spirituality, and then coaching as a way to develop as a human being. So, and I've just used here a definition of spiritual leadership, which is an ability, and of course there are other definitions, but just so you know what it is that the coaching program is designed around. So it's to approach situations with an attitude of discernment rather than intervention, acceptance rather than control, and letting go rather than controlling, with an attitude of listening rather than action, and humility rather than competence. So this is very much what could be considered a relational model and not a rational one, where it is relational because we are wanting to make sense of what is happening and taking care of who is making sense of what is happening, as opposed to wanting to find a solution to whatever crisis or issues that are in the community at this time. Of course, we are taking that into consideration as well, but focusing on the people. So in terms of the type of coaching that is available for various communities or other types of organizations, of course, we have individual coaching, team coaching, and organizational coaching. And in this case, it is mostly individual coaching and team coaching. And I was saying that it is a work in progress, and there's been a new request with the election of the new board, and they have requested some organizational coaching. So when we are able to look at the communities from a holistic and systemic perspective, well, it could bring even more fruitful outcomes for all. So when we talk about rationality to relationality and how we take that into account when we design a coaching program, that's basically what I will be sharing with you. So obviously in the process we identify issues, and then we have a look at them, and then we explore ways to design a program around them. So two glasses that have been added to process is what is called two-eyed seeing and calling in. So you'll see that those approaches are mainly being used at the moment to what is very important in Canada, in many different types of organizations and communities and even government agencies. It's this whole notion of decolonization. So what two-eyed seeing and calling in allows is a way to decolonize. So in other words, it's to look at, but also to find out and to develop, to design approaches that are not just Western based. So to be as inclusive as possible. So when we two-eyed seeing is basically was developed here in Canada by Marshall. So seeing with one eye is with the strength of indigenous ways of knowing, and seeing with the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and using those two eyes together. So it's not a question of one is better than the other, one is more relevant than the other. It's this notion of making sure that at least we're able to look at a situation, look at a program design, or even when we're looking at identifying issues from with both eyes. So here the goal is really to bridge the gap in power and understanding between the researcher and indigenous process. So when that is applied to a non-indigenous community, in this case it is between a coach and an organization. So, like I said, the emphasis is to learn how to decolonize processes and to consciously activate the right lens based on circumstances. So in some cases, one lens could be more dominant than the other. So there is agility and flexibility. The calling in, some of you may have heard about the calling in is it's a call to migrate from the current calling out, because in terms of the way that many situations are being dealt with at the moment is that we tend to call out and there are quite a few movements that tend to call out. This one is about calling in. So when there is an issue, it's this notion of addressing, creating an invitation, welcoming issues with love and respect. So again, it is based on relationships and not just about, I'm going to solve this issue and get rid of the issue. Sometimes meaning I'll get rid of the person. No, we are a community, and there is a way. There is a way to reinvent or invent ways of including love and respect in what it is that we do, but mostly in who we are as well. So the calling in approach invites private conversations with the goal of focused and compassionate teaching. Calling in engages in discussions with words and actions of healing and restoration. So when and this is the case in this community, when there's been quite a bit of hurt, even if it's a community that is there to really support one another, love one another, practice empathy. So there something had happened that created quite a bit of hurt, and that required healing. So how do we approach that in a accompaniment way, and how do we use the coaching to support this? So a relational approach, and this is based on an Aboriginal way of looking at, this is more from Australia in terms of the model. And I'll just say this fairly quickly because I'm not wanting to get into this too much. A relational approach is based on respect. So you start with respect. There's no relationship without respect. So it's about having this respect. It's about connecting with other people, at the same time reflecting on our relationship and then acting. And and when we talk about a decolonized way of being, I'll use that particular expression, in a North American Western way of interacting, we tend to start with action. So we start with number 4, and then we reflect, then we connect, and then we see if there's respect. So many times respect is something that is an outcome, as opposed to, in this case, and not really as opposed to, but respect is an outcome instead of a given. So in other words, there cannot be any type of relationship if respect is not there at the beginning. So of course, when we do work in settings that are cross-cultural, and especially with Indigenous, this is something that is very, very important to pay attention to. And coaching, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with this. It is a type of accompaniment, and that focuses on the relational system and the process through which people become conversational partners. So again, this whole notion here is not about coaching for performance or it's about coaching about learning and being who we are, and at the same time being able to engage in meaningful relationships, but mostly meaningful conversations. All those conversations that sometimes we tend to have with everyone, except the person with whom we have the issue. So it's to learn to have those difficult conversations, to be authentic, and to, of course, do our best. So there are other, so the program, like I said, has been going on for 2 years. It's quite a bit of insights and learning, which eventually will be published, and I'll gladly share those. But as we continue the program, and now that we are working more from an organizational perspective, there are still other questions that I'm wanting to consider in terms of the approach and how to best support a community in crisis, basically. So this whole notion of the leadership culture of a community, and this is more of a curiosity on my side, in the sense that many leadership culture are based on violence, and sometimes we are not even aware that it is violent. So we've learned it so well that we've become unconscious about sometimes it's the way we make decisions, sometimes it's the way we don't make decisions. So the notion of violence, identity, and power, of course, in a culture of a community, of an organizations, are definitely worth exploring a bit more. The differences between a complicated system and a complex system. Complicated system we tend to deal with from a technical perspective. A complex system we deal with from a systemic, from an adaptive perspective. So to me, it's this notion between continuity and coherence. And when I talk about the foundational myth and some of the struggles and why people engage or what was their initial engagement, these are all issues in terms of sometimes we tend to confuse continuity with coherence. So continuity would be I've engaged and it's been 25 years later and I'm still continuing the same thing even though everything around me has changed. So how do we go from continuity to coherence? So this is always an interesting conversation to have with groups and individuals. And one of the, what I would say, which is my purpose in life, I'm really wanting to provide helpful help to help helpers change. So that's a lot of, for francophones, it's a lot of H. Because sometimes as French Canadians, some people have difficulty pronouncing the H in English, but helpful help to help helpers change. So people draw energy from their visions and dreams. And that same energy sustains their efforts to change, even through difficult times. In contrast, problem-centered approaches trigger psychological responses that make a person defensive and less open to new ideas. So my interest in coherence is as much with making sure that whatever approach, methodology that is being used, that it is in alignment, that it shares the same spirit as the community, the individual with whom the accompaniment is being provided. And I think that's about it for today, for now.
I propose that we have first the other presentations and then see how can we all the questions, the connections.
Gerard, shall I just move on to Odile?
Yes, I would hand it over to the next presentation, and that would be Odile Carroll, the intersections of visibility and race in Camphill conversations and initiatives. So if you would please introduce yourself and share your thoughts on the presentation.
Hi, everyone. If you have any issues, my name is Odile Carroll. If you have any issues hearing me or any technical things, please let me know or the tech know. As I said, my name is Odile Carroll. I am currently a doctoral student at the University of Illinois, Chicago in the Disability Studies program, which is the only standalone department of disability studies in the United States. Before starting this program, before and during, I've been connected to the Camphill movement in the US for, at this point, about 15 years. I started as a family member of an individual, my uncle, who is developmentally disabled. And I then moved on to be a coworker in a specific community in the US, have spent a couple years living in community there, and now hold various roles of support and engagement and with Camphill communities across the US, one being also that for my master's thesis research in community development, I highlighted some intersections between kind of Camphill life and everyday living, and some home and community-based service Medicaid changes in funding structures that had these unique impacts on intentional community life. So I come at this conversation with kind of an academic lens and an everyday applied lens of knowing what it is also to be immersed in Camphill and Camphill living. This being said, my goal for this presentation is that it feels more like a conversation and an opportunity for engagement. My research and thinking about the intersections of disability and race have come in Camphill, in and beyond Camphill, but in this conversation, I'll be thinking with Camphill, have a lot to do with experiences that I had living in a Camphill community a couple of years ago at the time of a lot of racial justice efforts that came about in the United States, specifically in 2020. I'll get into that in a minute. And that as a result of these recent movements, this realm of research and thinking about what organizational response to diversity and equity and inclusion look like is pretty nascent. And so therefore, just again, clarifying that this is narrative. The goal of this is to feel like narrative, to feel like a conversation, and to feel like what I put forward could be treated as a living document or a proposal that I'm really actively interested in hearing reflection on. At the end of the day, I do want to acknowledge my positionality as a white person presenting on the ways that I've seen and heard about intersection of race and disability in Camphill and beyond. I really want to push against the idea of coming across as an expert in this space of anything beyond my experience. And so thus kind of this emphasis on conversation, not presenting a truth that, presenting a truth that is perhaps not universal and very situated. For the couple of the points that I'm going to make, I went through a process of, again, the lived experience that I have had, some informal interview, observation, and then a bit of archival work. This is, again, to come forward with a proposal. Obviously, if I move forward with this research, it will take a very different formal process. So for some context and background for those of you who may not be from the United States or as plugged into kind of the on the ground impact of some of these issues, I will speak very directly about events that have happened in the United States that I believe set forward a platform that launched some very important and complex work in Camphill and beyond Camphill. Most notably, the events that occurred on May 25th, 2020, which was significantly the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In the weeks and months that followed the murder of George Floyd, protests were held across several cities in the United States and abroad, as many of you probably know. And importantly, many of these protests were organized by or presented within the umbrella of the Black Lives Matter movement, which came about really formally in the US in 2014, 2015. These protests and public outcries ranged in their demands and visions, but generally spoke to degrees of systemic and individual accountability for what was referred to as the police state and other institutions and structures in the United States that are either actively harmful, very directly harmful towards marginalized identities, a focus on Black and Brown lives and identities, but then also how the movement was also seeking kind of a call in for organizations and institutions that may not be maybe as directly in that line of harm, but also could be interrogating the ways that they are experiencing power, privilege, access that is disproportionate according to racial identity and access as well. So generally, this movement swept the United States, drew national attention for racial justice work. But it's also important to remember that justice work in and of itself, transformative justice work, does not just focus on a singular issue, but focuses on the ways that racial justice work intersects and highlights work across immigration, disability, education systems, gender, healthcare reform, that kind of truly moving forward with liberation or equity for all, is not choosing one issue over another, but thinking about these holistically. And so keeping that in mind, I had an experience, or I experienced a lot of the result of this movement as a coworker working in one specific community in 2020 and 2021. This is the same community that I actually lived in as an AmeriCorps volunteer in 2015, which, as many of you remember, and as I've mentioned, was the connect close to the formal birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. And to have kind of the juxtaposition of what it was to be a Camphill coworker in these years, 2015 and 2020, was fairly significant. I will say that's something that the affective change of approach in this particular community towards these questions and what they have to do with Camphill, what they have to do with the lives of the folks with disabilities we live and work with, were very different. And I think that this is largely reflective of a more mainstream organizational effort, again, across the ways that organizations, nonprofits, institutions were called in 2020 in a different way than 2015. And then to have that comparison and see the ways that Camphill movement in the US largely responded to that call in and that work with interest. And yeah, I think also elements of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2015 still felt a little bit on the margins, I would say. And so again, seeing kind of the integration into this work in 2020 does make sense. So this being said, prior to 2020, while there were seeds of racial justice, social justice efforts beyond Camphill in many individual communities in the US, in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, several communities began to more formally take up organizational and critical work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and kind of connected to statements or solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. While this kind of happened broadly across communities, there were various levels of recognition and symbolism in each individual community space. Particularly in, I think, intersection, important conversation, understanding the history of Camphill, the history of being a disability service provider, the history of, the origins of this community coming from, for those of you who may not know, a German doctor fleeing Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s with he was a pediatrician, several of his patients who were disabled children to Scotland to escape what would be obviously persecution by the state. So the origin of the movement, I think, was drawn on a lot too, and offered kind of fertile bed for thought and connection and commitment to these conversations. And so that's kind of an abstract way that you see these overlaps in 2020 and the ways that they materialized on the ground in my experience, and also coming from experiences of folks I've spoken to, were taken up in a variety of ways. So whether that was, there were several internal working groups and internal and cross-community reading and discussion groups. There were several communities that moved forward releasing statements following the murder of George Floyd and kind of the uptick of racial justice commitment and work that, again, individual organizations, movements took up. And then there were also, I think what's notable, formal trainings and educational spaces that were offered to most members of the community that were subsidized by the Camphill Foundation, kind of the broad philanthropic arm of Camphill in the US, that hired DEI consulting groups to kind of begin to unpack these questions and relationships, opportunity for overlap between Camphill, the work it does, its philosophy, and then on the ground racial justice and advocacy work. Something that is notable and really kind of, I'd say, an interesting highlight to me that was the impetus for dialogues that I am interested in having, reasons that I'm interested in, in being here today and hearing what you all think, are kind of some unexpected intersections or themes that came up as a result of how this work was at once complete and complex, and also perhaps not nuanced or intersectional in the ways that it needed to be or needs to be, understanding that we are all in processes of learning and educating ourselves, and that is a imperfect process in which we learn and grow, and then also propagate harm in instances as well. So remembering all of these efforts that have been taken up across Camphill communities, and also remembering that all of this was happening during, 2020, 2021, in the winter, particularly when there was lockdown across several communities due to COVID, due to working and living with vulnerable populations to COVID and its effects. One of the things that happened, and I'll speak from my experience in this one community, was on top of everything that I mentioned that communities were taking up, this particular community was also supplementing with community conversation, art projects, musical projects, really engaging biography sharing, Black leaders in the United States, taking on these efforts in this particular, bubble of COVID isolation that we were in. And while that process was incredibly powerful to be a part of, it yielded an issue that I think is reflective of larger social movement group leadership and organizing, and kind of the importance of need for coalition work. But essentially, due to some of the forces that I've mentioned and the urgency of this work, we moved forward within this Camphill with a gesture of anti-racist work that was powerful and taken up in the community with an urgency that was really important, but it was concurrently entirely inaccessible to all members of our community, and not intentionally, I believe, but the yield was that we were having conversations and creating spaces for able-bodied members of our community and not necessarily thinking critically or holistically about the work we were doing and its point of access for all members, specifically members of the folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who we live and work with. And this is a result of, again, I think this urgency, isolation of the moment we were in time, and also, frankly, the fact that there is not, at least to my knowledge, formal anti-racist toolkits or working groups or consulting spaces that are committed to the tenets of racial justice and accessible for the intellectual and developmental disability community. So this moment and this tension and this oversight on our part is unfortunately reflective, I think, of a movement that is finding its feet, finding its footing in ensuring moving forward with tenets of change needed in the United States, while also continuing to build coalition and engagement with other communities and marginalized identities. So as a result of this oversight and this kind of incomplete process, there was an instance where a community member with an intellectual disability made a comment to a young coworker of color in this community who had taken up a leadership role in the work that we were doing. And the result, again, this very specific social space, unfortunately, and I think a reflection of the precarious leadership structure that preceded this moment, was that there was a rapid effort that did not succeed, but it was a rapid effort to ask this individual with disabilities to leave the community because of this comment. However, this did not move through. I think that there were several folks who spoke out against this decision that was, moved forward by the executive director. It did not materialize. The director left instead, propelling a fissure in leadership that I think, as I said, was already structurally there, but compounded by the tension and eruption, that occurred due to this incident. So why am I sharing this incident? I share this to demonstrate again the dearth of resource, the intersection of race and disability that predates Camphill, but I think also is a reason why Camphill is well positioned to offer something unique compared to other organizational efforts and responses to DEI work and Black Lives Matter movement and allyship. The goal here, while there was pain in that process and a leadership adjustment that I think this community is still recovering from and navigating, I think that it propelled conversation about the importance of, as we move forward with these movements, not ever foregoing an identity that we have as a community and identity in the work we're doing in tandem with identities as a reflection of commitment to social justice work broadly. I think that movement, that moment, offers an opportunity to remember the need as I said, for intersectional work, a term maybe you all know, intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which is essentially calling in the need for exploration of identity work across multiple identities, right? That we never choose or engage or forget that our identities, when we're talking about race, when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about disability, intersect with our other social identities, that my identity with race is held in tandem with my identity as a woman, as an able-bodied person, et cetera, and that creates a situated experience. And so I think that that's something that we hear both from racial justice spaces, disability justice spaces, disability rights spaces, as kind of a research spaces in disability, as a tenet or as a requirement to not lose sight of opportunities for fertile development and fruitful research and engagement. I think that one of the most important things that this moment of time that I experienced in this community and this moment in time in the United States that we're living in a justice perspective is the ways that I see Camphill situated uniquely to move forward kind of in the middle of a lot of these spaces or in the middle of these spaces and in a unique position of care and identity formation. And so one of the things in these conversations that I want to bring up too is also the ways that disability justice work and tenets of disability justice should be utilized as opportunity for Camphill to move forward and continue. So one of the things that I think is most important, disability justice for you all, for those of you who don't know, was born out of a working group in Northern California that was in response to a disability rights movement that meant to speak to the inadequacies and lack of visibility of folks with disabilities in the United States from a policy and legal perspective. That came about in the 70s and 80s, and then disability justice kind of came forward in the early 2000s to put forward the fact that conversations about disability care, advocacy, and activism can also not lose sight of intersections with race, privilege, class, visibility, even within the disability community, how intellectual and developmental disability compared to physical disability are held in these conversations, visibility around that. So I think that there's something really important to say that in Camphill's experience with this work, in Camphill as an organization and moving forward, returning to or committing to tenets of disability justice work, I think stands to offer pretty prolific and profound change within communities and then beyond communities, thinking about models of care and advocacy. And one of these reasons is because Camphill communities are inherently also disability service providers for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And in anti-racist work, this is an asset. These conversations that we can, I think, look at ourselves, and this is something I'm interested in exploring, as research opportunity to develop toolkits and conversations and engagement that would be really hard to navigate from such a communal and collective effort and conversation in other disability spaces. This is primarily because we are a structured, in many cases in the US, intentional community. And due to the fact that many of us live and work together in these small spaces, I think there's opportunities to try on these tenets of disability justice. For example, one being, calling in a leadership and inclusion of folks with disabilities in care and community engagement that I think that feels to me, due to the size and nature of these spaces, more possible in Camphill, that then could, I think, be proliferated and shared with larger spaces of disability care in the US in how they're navigating anti-racist work and intersectional work across race, disability, class, et cetera. I also think that there's an opportunity for kind of in calling in Camphill's interest and pretty profound engagement, desire to take up this work as a community. There's a pretty significant call in for ways that like we look at how not only has a lot of disability work foregone or not included conversations around race, but the other way has been true as well. So there is a lot of literature that's starting to come out. I'm thinking specifically about a text from the Harriet Tubman Collective, other activists who are actually calling in anti-racist work in its lack of accessibility, not just in Camphill, beyond Camphill, in the Black Lives Matter movement. In a lot of the original texts in 2015 from the Black Lives Matter movement, there is not a mention of how race and disability intersect. And so again, Camphill being the size that it is, the orientation and philosophy that it has, not only thinking about ways to incorporate conversations of race into this space as a disability service provider in the US, but also thinking about how it can offer fertile ground for conversations or infusing conversations with disability into these anti-racist spaces and advocacy work that I think is pretty important, necessary. And I think, again, one of the things that Camphill being such an everyday work, everyday care platform reminds us is that this work is not abstract. You know, as much as we talk about these buzzwords or these tenets or these initiatives, I think how grounded all of us are as Camphill community members is a reminder that there is everyday impact. The situation that I was in this Camphill a couple of years ago is a reminder of everyday impact and care that happens on a micro level, that there's, you know, that I think offers opportunity for this work to be taken up in a very real, practical, grounded way that I think sometimes these broader movements lose sight of. Unintentionally, of course, it's a lot to take on entire structures and systems, but again, Camphill's work being so rooted in an everyday community space provides opportunity to go about this work in a variety of ways. And yes, and I think there's other elements of disability justice, elements of Camphill overlap when it comes down to leadership structure, when it comes down to even economic structure, the capacity for thinking about some of the more material changes of disability justice, again, offered kind of a unique space to explore in Camphill. Disability justice calls in tenets of redistribution of resources, thinking differently about admissions process, thinking differently strategically and organizationally about how people respond to conversations and engagement with race, that I think there's something about the scale, effort, kind of humanitarian and care-oriented work that Camphill does, that, as I've said, you know, again and again, provide fertile ground for this conversation or these explorations or changes in a way that, as they, I think, can start, the ways that they can uniquely start in Camphill, offer models to then, I think, carry out to larger nonprofit organizations, NGOs, institutions, both of disability care and beyond disability care in the United States. So I think that I will stop there. I'm really trying to my hope is to offer intersection and conversation between disability justice, tenets of disability justice, and Camphill care that I'm not seeing in a lot of spaces. In fact, I see sometimes perhaps some tension between these worlds, being in a program of disability studies that is very much rooted in disability justice and the background and experience I have with Camphill. I feel like I sit in the middle and see a lot of opportunity for conversation and connection between these two worlds. And I think the platform that it can happen, one of the platforms it can occur in is in anti-racist, accessible anti-racist work. But of course, you know, this is a heavy and intense issue that requires care and intentional conversation. So my goal here is to start this conversation, imagine possibilities for toolkits, imagine how Camphill can be a unique opportunity and praxis of this, while knowing that this is, of course, the start of a very long and complex conversation that is not to be oversimplified. So looking forward to hearing what resonates at a later point. And I thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to picking up later. As we are not only intellectual and psycho-spiritual beings, but also bodily beings, we're proposed to have not a break, but one purpose session for body needs, water in, water out, stretching, get a sip of air, whatever. And we'll meet in 3 minutes again here for our last in-person presentation and afterwards for our sessions. So 3 hours, not break, but all purpose sessions. Yes, see you here at 5 to 5.
Would you enable chatting during this break?
Chat.
No, oh, Libby, could you enable chatting while we're in break? Maybe Libby's already left. Well,
No, I can't. My hosting privileges disappeared. So the Adonicon is the host and they'll need to control those features.
Kai, could you enable chatting during the break? Thank you.
I think I've just done it.
And I also just wanted to say hello to all the Newton D folks. It's lovely to see a community being a community here at our conference. And thank you, Odile. That was amazing. I have so many questions.
I'm going to go ahead and check my volume levels. How are people hearing me here and in Zoom?
It's good on Zoom.
Thank you.
Lovely beings, I'd like to call you in. So, just a short announcement tech-wise that now posts should be like distributed again. Right way. Libby, you're the host again. And then I'm looking forward to our last presentation in this session by Joe Cole on evolving radical justice strategies in intentional communities. And please just introduce yourself. You have half an hour.
Thank you. And how's my volume? Is that still okay?
Your volume,
thumbs up.
your volume is good. We don't have the camera on you though. There
Is
you
that
are.
better? All right.
Yep, great.
Thank you. Right. So while I'm getting this slideshow set up, I want to just name that I have a fragile voice today, and I would like some assistance reading quotes from the interview. So I have several slides that have quotes from the interviews, and I don't know if this is going to work with the tech setup. Either someone, I guess, in the room who has a mic or someone on Zoom could read the quotes when I need help with that. That would give my voice a break. Is anybody interested or willing? All right. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, thank you for being here, everybody. I'm Joe Cole, and I work as a facilitator, and I work with intentional communities around facilitation, conflict navigation, collaborative governance, mostly communities in the southeastern United States. I live in North Carolina. I'm also a professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in the Peace and Conflict Studies department there. And so the basis of this work, this is a project that's in progress, and I'm interviewing people who live in intentional communities or are connected to intentional communities who are doing racial justice or racial equity work. And it's interesting to me, if you look at the FIC mission, that it mentions supporting communities on paths towards a more cooperative, sustainable, and just world. So racial equity, racial justice for me is one of the dimensions of a more just world. And I decided I wanted to talk to people who are doing specifically racial equity or racial justice work in intentional communities. Why is this an issue? I've lived in a co-housing community, and I've been a member of a forming eco-village project and visited a lot of communities in the United States. And, there's a pattern there that a lot of members of intentional communities are white, middle to upper class, a lot of privilege, and yet they're seeking in some ways to escape from a dominant culture, right? That is very competitive, hierarchical, oppressive, but oftentimes their idealism that leads them to community blinds them to what they're bringing themselves from the dominant culture. So issues of competition, individualism, sexism, and white supremacy. So sometimes I've noticed that intentional community members we can see ourselves as, we're radical, we're alternative, we're doing something that's so different from mainstream society, and neglect patterns of hierarchy, exclusion, inequity that they're actually reproducing in the group and in the larger society. In addition, some white members might view racial equity work as outside the scope of creating sustainable community. And I've heard from some communitarians, white communitarians, who've even said that doing racial equity work in community is actually harming the community. So here's a quote from Alan from New Mexico.
There is an equity deficit within co-housing. Communities want diversity, but don't know how to go about it. Here's Danny. I hear pain from Black, Indigenous, people of color friends and queer friends wanting community that is land-based and yet not feeling comfortable moving out to rural areas with majority white groups. Monica says, it's important to me that the resources and community that we're able to provide to each other by living together are accessible to those of all ethnic backgrounds, especially to those from historically marginalized groups.
Is there anybody in the tent here? No? I have a tent. You might need to.
It's raining now.
It's a tent. It's designed for rain. Thanks.
So these are quotes. Thank you, Dan, for reading those quotes from folks that I interviewed, and we're going to see some more their thoughts and feelings about this work. But I wanted to say a little bit about why I see race and racism as an important issue for communities to address, especially in the United States. And race in the United States, we have certain racial categories that have become dominant, and they were created historically. We can map this out in the 1600s and 1700s, where there wasn't really a term for white or whiteness until that period of the colonization of the Americas. And racial categories were used as a strategy to divide and conquer, because indentured servants from Europe were actually getting together with indentured servants and enslaved people from Africa and Native Americans, and they were rebelling against the colonial elites. And so the colonial elites came up with this, tragically brilliant strategy of trying to divide the European immigrants from others in the population, and convince the poor or lower class European immigrants that they had more in common with the colonial elites than they did with people who had the same socioeconomic status. And so we see the development of the history in the United States. Whiteness became entrenched in the laws in the 1600s and 1700s, and then ideas of race and white supremacy spread, and people started seeing that these racial categories as somehow natural or biological, but they don't have any biological basis. They're social constructions. Of course, they're very real and they're impactful. And so when we talk about race and racism, I like to emphasize we're talking about systems of oppression. We're not just talking about personal prejudice. And so you can see, in this painting by Jacob Lawrence, the emphasis on structural oppression, right? It's not just about personal prejudice. The people in the chains might have some prejudice towards the people on the horses, but that's not racism, right? Racism is the prejudice plus systemic social power. And so in the United States, we see racism functioning as a social, economic, cultural system that divides people on the basis of racial categories and distributes benefits and burdens and harms according to those groupings. Most people today in the United States are assimilated into what I would call white supremacy culture. They're not consciously adopting white supremacist ideals or values. They're not members of the Klan, but we're taught as white people to believe that we are somehow superior and that we deserve an elevated status in the social hierarchy. In these categories, even though they're not biologically real, they have a major impact on life and outcomes. And we're not just talking about, the period of slavery, which is a little more obvious, and segregation in the United States, but in the 20th century, how Social Security, minimum wage, educational benefits, federal housing loans were directed towards white people and away from people of color. And they were designed consciously with those racial categories in mind. And then today, we still see issues with mass incarceration, targeting people of color, and bad outcomes across systems in health, education, finances, and legal. And one example of this is the economic outcomes. And you can see this is a chart. I hope you can see it, but visually it's on the top, the bar is the median household wealth for white people in the United States. And on the bottom, the red bar is the median household of the median wealth of Black households in the US. And the yellow or orange is Latino households. And this runs from 1983 to 2020. So you can see that, for me, this is evidence that there's historical patterns of directing wealth and resources towards white people in the United States. And regardless of reforms, real reforms and changes that have happened in the US, there's still these profound inequities. And of course, the median household means that 50% of the population is above that and 50% is below it. So we're looking at the median household wealth for people of color, Blacks and Latinos, around 10,000. That was before the 2008 recession and economic crash. And now it's about 1,500, okay? So that means 50% of Black and Latino households in the United States have less wealth than $1,200. So, and wealth is money, assets minus debt, okay? So looking at a chart like this, we can kind of predict who's going to have the resources, financial resources and other resources to create intentional communities. So it should not be a surprise that most intentional communities in the US context are mostly white, overwhelmingly white. And yet we see, people come together trying to create intentional community, eventually ask themselves, why are we so white? How can we be more diverse? What's going on here? And so some folks, have taken steps towards addressing these issues, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. I want to say, make one more reference, and this is to Victor Ray, who talks about racialized organizations. And he believes that, especially in the United States context, all organizations are racial structures that people involved in those structures based on race. So there are patterns here, right? It's not a guarantee of certain outcomes, but he says racialized organizations are social structures that limit the personal agency and collective efficacy of subordinate racial groups while magnifying the agency of dominant racial groups. And so in the US context, whiteness is a credential. It gets you more access to jobs, education, resources, gets you free pass if you get stopped by the police. So there's a lot of advantages for being white. And we can think, structurally, systemically, but also on the local level. Local small scale community organizations are also racialized organizations. So this work on racism, the history of racism and how it operates in the United States has impacted me and my connection to communities. And so I wanted to talk to other people who've been wrestling with these questions of how do we address these historical and ongoing inequities in our society and our communities within our intentional community. And so I've been doing some interviews this spring and summer, and I've completed 14 so far. And again, all of these people are in intentional communities and doing racial equity work, okay? 8 men, 6 women, ages ranging from the 20s to the 70s, 7 white, 2 white who identify as Jewish, 2 white who were born in Europe and immigrated to the United States, 1 Black or African American, and 2 Asian American. There was a total of 12 communities represented. I interviewed multiple people from some of the same communities, 5 co-housing, 3 eco-village, 2 housing cooperatives, and 2 co-living. One of the questions that I asked them was, how does racial justice or racial equity show up in your official community agreements, values, mission statement, vision? And 2 of the 12 of them had something about racial equity or racial justice, but most of them did not have anything in their guiding documents and agreements. Okay, so one of the questions that I asked was, why do this work? And actually, I didn't start with this question because one of the questions that I do ask is, are there any questions that you wish I had asked you? And what are your responses to that question? And fortunately, maybe the second interview that I did, somebody said, well, I think an important question is, why do this work? Great, thank you for that. So the rest of the people, I was able to ask that question, why do this work? So here's some more quotes. Sorry, Dan.
Kathy from North Carolina says, if groups don't do racial equity work in community, they will miss the depth of human connection by living in a bubble. It can feel comfortable living in a bubble, but it's not real and it's not right to live in a bubble and not address issues that impact people in our community and beyond our community. Kyle from Virginia says, to make a better world, start from the ground up with justice and equity. Maya from North Carolina says, it is a basic central value that communities need to be fully representative of the world in which the community is embedded. If we think eco-villages are the ideal way to engage with the land and be in community, then they need to be open and welcome and available to everybody. If we want to break down the segregated worlds we live in, we need to live together. Nora from Virginia says, if we claim to live together in a cooperative way, and we don't work to understand each other across diverse cultures and experiences, groups are essentially excluding non-whites or the non-dominant culture or race.
And here's one more quote that also was connected to this question, why do this work? But for me, it really captured the connections between sustainability and justice.
Monica from Texas says, considering how environmental degradation disproportionately impacts people of color and marginalized groups and benefits white people in the United States, sustainability necessarily includes racial justice. To be truly sustainable means addressing inequality so everyone has access to healthy food, a healthy environment, and healthy lives.
Thanks, Dan. So another question that I asked is, what are y'all doing? What are you doing in your community? What's happening around racial equity, racial justice? And so some examples of what people are doing, regular book groups or film groups or dialogues and discussion groups around racism and racial equity, hosting workshops and trainings on racial equity, racial awareness, developing strategies for addressing microaggressions or instances of racism in the group, putting racial justice in the mission or the values or the policies, reducing joining fees and or dues for BIPOC members. It was an example of a community that has a work hour requirement, and they were giving basically credit to BIPOC members, a couple hours of credit, and saying, we understand you're going to be experienced in a majority white group. BIPOC members are going to be experiencing microaggressions, racialized harm, and they need some recovery time. So we're going to, reduce the hour requirement for our work requirement for BIPOC members who can use that for self-care and recovery. Other efforts around networking with local and regional anti-racist organizations. Some groups were exploring native land acknowledgements. Others were addressing white supremacy culture in the group, and I've used that term a couple times, and that's a reference to work by Tema Oakland and others about specific characteristics that you can see in group culture where whiteness is the predominant group culture. And it's usually invisible to whites, but it's very visible to non-whites. So trying to address, what are those characteristics? How are they manifesting in our group? Shifting or donating percentage of income and resources to BIPOC organizations, organizing work days to support BIPOC communities, and gifting land to BIPOC organizations or communities. And so one of the harvestings for me so far was just, getting all these examples and trying to organize them and understand, what are some levels of racial equity work. And so I've grouped them into five levels so far. And one level is the personal, intrapersonal work. So in several of these groups, there's not a group-wide buy-in to racial equity work. It's individuals doing the work on their own. So they're doing reading reflection. Maybe they're doing some training, maybe with a couple of neighbors, but the focus is really, I'm as an individual member of this community, I want to improve my racial awareness and see what I can do around racial equity. There's also an informal interpersonal level where, again, there's not whole group buy-in. The whole community is not committed to doing the work of racial equity or racial awareness, but maybe a smaller group, a subset of the members are doing this together, like in the book group, study groups, or doing some voluntary racial equity training where not all members are expected to attend. Then there's the level of the group culture. Are we changing the culture? Are we including racial equity or justice in the vision, mission, policies? Are we talking about communication across cultural boundaries? Are we expecting members, all members, to do racial equity training? Are we committing as a group to allocate resources to BIPOC organizations? And the events and celebrations, are they addressing issues around race and racism? The next level, connecting with local networks, works and institutions. So this could be volunteer work and service work or political activism. And then similar work at the regional, national, and international levels. So those are some categories that just help me organize, what's actually going on, what's possible out there. So I also asked the participants, what are some challenges that you're facing in this work, racial equity work? Dan, if you could.
Sarah from Minnesota says, it's hard enough getting along as a white group. We're not set up to properly welcome and support non-European people.
And Sarah is someone who lives in a community in Minneapolis, just a few blocks away from where George Floyd was murdered. Okay, and so and she was similar though to members of other groups, other communities who said that event, as Odile mentioned, that event was quite impactful in their community. And so, after that murder, there was a lot of discussion and questioning, what are we doing? But oftentimes there wasn't sustained momentum to really address issues around racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. So some of the challenges that came up that we can see patterns in mostly white communities of white members get focused on, let's increase diversity, let's attract a few BIPOC members. And that falls into a problematic dynamic of tokenism, right? Let's just get a couple of people of color in here and we'll feel a lot better about the diversity, but that's not necessarily good for the people of color in those communities. They're very vulnerable. Other challenges, attachment to comfort and complacement, a lack of serious engagement for racial equity and inclusion work, expecting the BIPOC members who are in the community to educate the white members, for free, basically, and then white members resisting joining dialogue. There's also this is connected to white supremacy culture, centering whiteness as the majority experience in the community and not having conversations about that, not questioning that. What is that? What does that look like? How does that impact people who are not white? One of the interviewees talked about how he's seen a pattern of white folks breaking off relationships when the going gets tough. So when the work gets really challenging, I can quit, right? I have enough privilege and resources and comfort in my life, I can step away from it. Another common challenge was that, and creating an intentional community and maintaining an intentional community is demanding. So there's attention and resources going to the other pressing demands in community. There's also the difficulty for white members to see negative impact of white words and behavior on people of color. And connected to what I said earlier, white people may show up with high energy for racial equity work at first and then fade out. And I think this has happened since 2020, when there was an upsurge of interest and seeming commitment from white people in the United States, not just in community contexts, but that has faded out to really address racism and racial equity. So other challenges: only meeting the needs of people with wealth and privilege, the presence of white privilege and white innocence. One interviewee talked about white innocence. And this could be connected to the mindset of colorblindness. I don't see race. I just see human beings, right? But that's actually saying that you don't understand how racism is functioning in our society, in our world, and in our group, how it's harming people of color. Yes, thank you. Many leaders and members still see racial equity as an out there problem and unexamined privilege impacting the group's decision-making process. Okay, successes: having more honest conversations, increasing skill when addressing racism in the group, attracting new members, white and people of color members willing to do that inner and outer work, avoiding shame and celebrating progress, creating deep, trusting relationships to do the work, building racial equity into community values and agreements, approving a budget for racial equity work, hiring consultants and trainers and actually paying them, and creating caucuses and safe spaces and support spaces for people of different ethnic and racial groups. So, a question that I'm holding as someone interested in community, not just as a researcher, is, can communities, intentional communities, transform towards social justice? And if we don't, I think we're going to end up dying of whiteness, right? So the question is, are we going to move towards anti-racism, or are we going to really kind of create these privileged bubbles that will not be sustainable and will die of our own whiteness? So another quote, Dan, if you help me out again, thank you.
T from California writes, racial awareness and justice work is so nourishing and beautiful. The more I do this work, the more it feeds me and the more I want to do it. As the momentum builds, the work is rewarding in the deepest part of me.
Thank you. That's the last one. And I'll just end with this quote from Ibram X. Kendi. One either allows racial inequities to persevere or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. Allows them to persevere as a racist or confronts them as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. And so can we support our communities in committing to anti-racism as an essential part of community life and sustainability going forward? Another harvesting that I want to share, and it's connected with, I think, some of what the other presenters have mentioned, is the powerful potential of communities to create deep and rich relationships that are mutually supportive. And that is actually a helpful container for doing social justice work or anti-racism work, because it is challenging, right? And so if you've actually developed relationships with people and you feel safe with them or safe enough with them, maybe even majority white spaces and communities have a foundation for doing deeper work around anti-racism, because it does require a lot of support and a lot of commitment. And so I think that's actually a kind of a pleasant surprise, because I came into this project feeling a little bit disillusioned about communities in the United States because of our whiteness, because of our privilege there. But I'm coming, so far in these interviews, I'm feeling more hopeful, I guess I would say. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I would like to recall also the other two presentations that we had. So we enter this space of dialogue. Maybe
Sorry, we're not able to hear if there's a mic.
mic check. It seems to be on. Mic check. Maybe I take this one.
I think the issue was just that it was too far from your
It was
mouth.
too far. Mic
Because
check.
you just gave us a thumbs up.
Now it works.
Now
Great.
it's-
All right. I just said thank you to Joe and announced that I would like to recall also the other two presentations that we had before we enter into a dialogue space reflecting three of them. And yeah, maybe yeah, we can just see all the Zoom participants. That would be great. So yeah, you just have another breath and remind yourself that we heard something from Marquis about coaching La Canada community. And we had something about two-eyed seeing and calling in. Afterwards, we heard Odile about intersections of disability and race, relating to Camphill. And last but not least, Joe took us through some ideas of racial justice within Indian communities. And now we have half an hour to get in contact around questions, ideas, remarks, and yeah, I would like to also open up the space for conversation between the participants on site and online. So this does not need to be necessarily one-to-one conversation between the presenters, but can be. So everyone welcome.
Can I ask a question? Is that all right? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Great.
you. Go for
Thank you. All of you. My name's Jenny and I do research in England. So I'm really interested in these questions around racism in particular. And I was wondering if I could ask Joe particularly whether any of the groups that are doing this racial equity work are producing toolkits for other communities, or whether that's a bit premature, because in England we're a step behind, I would say, and we're just starting these conversations, and it would be wonderful to know what resources might be possible to share, to have some of these workshops, to have some of these difficult conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know of groups, communities, intentional communities that are generating toolkits, but I do know several groups are creating Google Documents or Google Drives where they're gathering from other sources, right? Not intentional community specific sources, but they're gathering resources, information, links, videos, book lists, and creating Google Drives or Google Documents where members can access those, and then you're sharing them out within the communities. But I love the idea of, let's create a toolkit specifically for intentional communities. So let me know when you're finished with that and just email it to me.
Does anybody else knows toolkits or tools that are especially suitable for intentional communities? You need the mic to be inclusive for the online community.
And Gary, it sounds like your mic has maybe slipped again. It's hard to hear you online.
All right. Thanks for.
That's better.
All right.
Thank you.
I just wanted to bring in a phrase from the disability rights movement. Nothing without us, nothing about us without us. So with that in mind, I want to mention that FIC created a BIPOC advisory council, and that council has been organizing its own discussions and conversations, sometimes only with members of the council and Black and Indigenous led organizations and nascent communities. So I just have to call that out. And also just say from my own faith religion that American Friends Service Committee, or Quakers, have put together a respectable collection of resources and tools from especially the young people of color and workers of color who have been involved in American Friends Service Committee justice projects around the country. And so I feel like the toolkits I saw there were respectful and useful. They're not specific to intentional communities. We are lacking some essential expertise in effect. So
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. FIC, I think a few years ago, there was an FIC generated resource list for this work, but I don't think it's available on the website. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
The North American Students of Cooperation, also known as NASCO, has generated enough students of color and anti-racist. They created a former members of student cooperatives on campuses now have a consulting practice, a consulting co-op that specializes in anti-oppression and anti-racist trainings, usually with multi-racial leaders leading. And that was the first step for the what's now the Foundation for Intentional Community to begin its work. We had a training with NASCO, which is one of the groups we actually, with this co-op of NASCO graduates that are part of our orbit. So anyway.
Yeah, and just one more thing about FIC, definitely check them out and see what they're doing that's evolving, and they're addressing these questions, more and more seriously. And there is, they're offering a variety of online Zoom-based workshops, including a couple on anti-oppression work. And I think there's one coming up maybe in August. It's like a 5 or 6 week session on Zoom with Crystal Bird Farmer, who's an African-American educator, trainer based in North Carolina. And she's really, really good. So she does great work. And that's being offered through the Foundation for Intentional Community, FIC. So you can check that out and find that online.
Gen Europe have also organized a few workshops over the last year on equality. And yeah, as you mentioned, that person, Crystal Bird Farmer, she was involved in those sessions. And then there's somebody else, I can't remember her name, Motsi, I think her name is, but she's got a sort of, like a training for, white people in communities, but also mixed communities and, yeah, people from different race. And, it's actually, she's got quite a lot of resources, and her work is mainly on that. I don't know if anybody knows the person I mean, who's been involved with Gen Europe.
She used to be at
Was she? I don't know. Anyway, I could maybe send you her details or so.
Yeah, there are more and more resources. I'm not sure what's happening there's a co-housing conference in the US coming up right this fall. I haven't looked at the end of August. Okay, so it's right around the corner, but I haven't looked at the presentation list, but I'm imagining there's probably at least a couple of there's not. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, there wasn't anything really much on racial equity work in co-housing at those conferences until, maybe about 5 years ago. But in recent years, I think intentional community organizations are becoming more aware and more committed to offering resources.
I have a question. and this is, I guess, mostly for Joe and Odile, although Marquis, you could also chime in. I was wondering if I could invite you into a kind of conversation about intersectionality. Joe talked about a lot of conversations he's had with people in intentional communities. Actually, I guess maybe this is really for Marquis and Odile both. What other elements would emerge in those conversations if, let's say, white people with intellectual disabilities were bringing their hopes and their anxieties about engaging anti-racism into the conversation? What would be similar? What would be different from what Joe described?
I think that's a really good question, Dan. And I think one that I'm thinking in lived experience, to me, it still feels so, the question still feels so much about the educational perspective. Like, how do you teach this knowledge to then offer a platform to even propel questions or concerns or anxieties or kind of affective response? I don't think, at least in my experience, we navigated even just getting everyone on, not even on the same page, like politically, but at least just kind of offering the information to folks across a wide range of mediums and channels to even, I think, propel towards that space. I think it's a really interesting question, but not, I'll have to think about it. But I think that primarily it was like educating kind of from a more removed or factual angle, not necessarily, I mean, I think not necessarily imagining specific intersection beyond that and like a personal or everyday. And I think also that could be rooted in the fact that I was in a Camphill community in a very white state in the United States too. So wondering if there was kind of a dearth of affective or relational experience to some of these topics that may have yielded the fact that I can't really come up with examples or intersections within the category that you're speaking to. But I think it prompts a very interesting question that I think would be possibly more reflected in other communities that were not the one that I was in too.
I guess I could say two things. What I'm hearing is that when we are faced with such a reality, because this is reality, it's not just something out there, some of us will want to look for tools. So some of us want to do something. And we think that if we're doing something, that somehow we're accomplishing something. Sometimes yes, sometimes maybe, but I haven't seen too many people transform through workbooks, workshops. I see people attending quite a few workshops and reading quite a few books, but in terms of how does one transform, it goes back to, and I guess I'm biased here, it goes back to the being and not the doing necessarily. The doing is important because that's what makes us human, but the emotional level, the drive, where we need to work on our beliefs, our socializations, ancient cultures would say our domestication, that does not happen by reading a book or even by meeting somebody who's extremely intelligent. The work with indigenous communities, for example, is the work is quite simple. You sit in a circle and you listen. That's what you do. And I've been listening for 20 years. And eventually, the being gets transformed somewhere. And I'm not saying that this is a recipe, because I don't want to turn this into into a solution, but there's something about having very close relationships amongst us, sharing meals, having opportunities to get invited to a birthday party. It could be as simple as that. But as long as we're learning through our intellect, basically we have an intellectual way of considering the question. So somehow the learning, the being needs to happen through the body. And that's where the heart gets changed, and that's where the heart eventually opens up. So there's a lot of healing work. And sometimes it doesn't mean that I need to get into a healing process, but to me it's the proximity, and it's the daily practice. I never saw anyone lose weight by reading a diet. So somehow we need to engage the body, and the heart will follow, because the heart is always there anyway.
I'd like to follow up on that. Go ahead, Odile, if you want to.
Oh, I was just going to say that Marquis reminded me, or I was prompted to think too about something that I'll expand on, which is that I think also one of the challenges in imagining this work in a very material way, when I've thought about what a toolkit would look like, when I've thought about sitting with my friends with intellectual or developmental disability and imagining what these conversations could look like or feel like, it's that in itself feels like a pretty big task, because I think there's a risk or there's a comfort in developing like a monolithic toolkit for what is in reality an incredibly diverse community of need and ability and communication and capacity. You know, I struggle to use that language for some political reasons with disability studies, but to say that there's a wide range of people who are going to resonate with a wide range of approaches. And so even just the task of imagining one toolkit or one approach is not going to work. And so the ways that I think we did have success, I'm remembering through prompting through what Marquis was sharing, was really individualized, very one-on-one with people, with folks we had, that we knew very well, that I'd had decades-long relationships with, to then imagine building kind of individualized processes, conversations, engagements, readings around an individual's personality, around knowing a lot about who they were and the way that they learned and the way that they thought and the way that they shared. I think probably is a good starting point, and also that it just feels almost inherently limiting due to the community that we're all, that we're working with in some way. So I think that you made some great points there, Marquis, that resonated and prompted me a little bit more. So thank you. Sorry, go ahead, not to interrupt.
Thanks. A couple of thoughts. Over intellectualism is like one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture, right? So we see, white people coming into this work. What's the best book I can read? And that doesn't mean books are not valuable. It's just that they get overvalued, or ideas get overvalued, and that's the problem. One of the problems in white supremacy culture: certain styles, certain approaches get overvalued. And I also agree. In my transformation has been grounded in relationships with people of color. And I heard that from several of the people that I see. And yet I don't want to tell white people, like, go out and make some relationships with people of color, because that's tricky for white folks. If we haven't done some of the inner work first, we're going to do damage. I mean, we're probably going to do damage anyway, but, I think we need to be respectful, mindful. I love the emphasis on sitting in a circle and listen for 20 years. And so I think, one strategy is, definitely as a white person, go to BIPOC majority spaces and organizations and listen and see if there's a way to serve and connect that way, and build those types of relationships. And then on the other hand, I think the idea or the framework of caucusing is important. And it was something that I struggled with when I first started doing this work, because I felt like, let's get everybody together and have these conversations and, sort through this. And then gradually I realized that, as white people, we do a lot of damage to people of color with our ignorance and our unexamined racism. And so pulling, people of color into those conversations where we're not prepared is damaging and dangerous. And so I see more and more the value of caucusing. And that was one of the pieces, for me coming out of these interviews, intentional communities as majority white spaces or all white spaces. Okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing if they're doing some anti-racism work together, because it's a powerful container for white people to help educate each other. We can educate ourselves together and not demand people of color to educate us. So there's a both and for me there.
And I think just to add to that too, broadly, when I was doing some of my informal interviews, I interviewed a few folks who are working in these worlds in organizations that are not intentional communities, that I would say from an external perspective, probably have very forward-thinking approaches. And I asked them the same questions that I prompted, that I shared with you all that I'm thinking about right now. And, I would say people have not come up with a lot of the answers to these questions, and what that engagement across labor, across, the need or use of affinity groups, the need or use of, working groups of particular combinations or representations of people, that we are in a very active kind of living document moment in these spaces. And to just contextualize, I think, all of our talks in that very much work in progress moment that is flawed and is part of, this practice of learning that will cause harm and, will cause need for repair, but is also, I think, exciting and interesting. But to me, that it was just interesting to hear Camphill very much on par or in some ways ahead of some of these spaces, that I don't know if I was expecting that. So the great point too, Joe.
We have a question from Kwan online, if that's possible, Joet.
Please, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, we will also love to have access to a toolkit for these issues, because also, as the two of us being Colombian, we've experienced some of these things non-intentionally, but both by residents and new coworkers. And having said that, though, and this one of my questions, because you said that the events in 2020 triggered the conversations in Camphill, but I was wondering if already the conversation was farther away already in the United States because of the visa process, because we experience here that now that after Brexit, that it was implemented, now that the volunteers that come here from mostly Germans from Europe, that they have the same requirements for visas, there's much more empathy in terms of this discrimination. And so the conversation has already changed because of this. So I wonder if it was already much more developed in the United States because of this reason. Thank you.
I think certainly that's a really important insight and observation. And I think I'm thinking of part of the work that I did when I was living in Camphill last year was in the admissions process, and to see even the tensions and conversations arising and going through visa processes from folks, depending on where they were coming from, being so racially divided, across, countries with, with histories of colonialism, right? And filtration in that capacity was very stark. And I think that Camphill, while these are in some ways insular spaces, in other ways bringing together such an international scope of experience and perspective and volunteer and, long-term members of the community, I do think it's kind of one, when I talk about how the structure of Camphill really offers a fertile ground for a lot of this, I think that is exactly one of the elements that has been in Camphill for such a long time, propelled, of course, by what you're speaking to with other political topics like Brexit. But it's just, there's so many moments that I've had in these spaces where I've thought, what other model of living would I ever be in a room surrounded by this particular constellation of people from across so many nations, across so many identities, ability, et cetera, that I think forces an engagement with difference that is very important to anti-racist work in general, to any social justice work, really being uncomfortable and engaging with the idea of difference non-hierarchically. And then that we would see still, again, this ways that it's offering something different, that it's insular, that's doing something, but then also still is privy to and affected by broader political decisions and spaces. Makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, I think that the US being generally larger, being more diverse, having a really, really different relationship to race, having a really different relationship to kind of civil rights movement that precedes a lot of the events of the last 6 years certainly makes it perhaps a little more fertile ground. But I think that there's also something about Camphill in the US, those two things together, that provide even more, I think, kind of opportunity for conversation and movement than other spaces. I think that's a really important question.
I would just like to share that from my perspective, situated within Germany, I think that we can learn a lot from the US American discourse of racial equality, because there are just like far more resources. But to me, it seems like we also have to deal with problems that are not as obvious over there on the other side of the sea. So the whole topic of like prejudices and also systemic systemic disadvantages for people from Eastern Europe is something that is not as visual or as visible as the whole discourse of racialized people, but is quite a strong it's quite an important topic for the question of equality within Europe, and brings also like another layer of complexity. If we want to adapt these models, then we also need to widen that.
Garrett, we can't hear you anymore. Sorry,
What
just
the
over the last
hell?
maybe 20 seconds, it started to go down.
Right.
There we go.
I'm nearly eating it. But
Keeps.
however, I just said that I think from a European perspective that we can learn so much from the discourse in the States, which is obviously more elaborated on the whole topic of racial justice, but that we in Europe have to deal also with other levels of complexity. For example, the whole thing of systemic disadvantages for people from Eastern Europe, which is not as visible, but something that we need to include in our awareness of equality. And then, Betsy, I want to share something on that. Yeah, the mic. Thanks.
This is a topic close to my heart, and sometimes I delude myself that I can help by sharing resources or my knowledge, which is incomplete. But I feel like for something like ICSA, if ICSA might think about things like scholarships from historically Black colleges and universities, which are strong in the US. I mean, it's a proud tradition. But have we had any scholars of Black communities? There's one or two, very new, but not so much from the intentional communities world. And so it's just a thought of cultivating scholarship or encouraging voices from the Black colleges and universities, which brings up the issue of the element of that only a minority of Americans have a college degree, and it's larger for younger people, but the elimination of, in California, the elimination of the ability to give some preferential points to, to Black or Latino students, the elimination of that means that our major and university has very, very few Black and Latino students. At the same time, I'm hearing from people I know of Asian descent or Asian immigration, their own feeling of exclusion and vulnerability now because of the anti-Asian hate crimes that came up in our state. So there's issues, there's the explicit racist history of the United States and other countries for sure, but there's an explicit racial history that's very hard. It's just so entrenched. How do we bridge the divide? Then there's, I also want to bring up something called the Institute, Othering and Belonging Institute, which is led by a scholar of color, a Black scholar, and has brought a whole new dimension to this issue of inclusion, and a language that is essentially kind of spiritually grounded, although in a very non-institutional religious way. So I offer that who do I belong with? That language captures a different dimension of that I think is essentially about community. Who do I commune with? So I just offer that. It's a institute out of Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, but I think previously the director, John Powell, was at another university. So just offer these thoughts of inspiration, I hope.
We will close the session soon. And Joe already asked me if he can make a final remark. I want to offer this also to the other panelists or presenters, and maybe also for those people in the room. So check in with yourself, and if you want to share something as a final remark, then prepare yourself to be concise, because we have another 3 minutes.
Thank you. And I wanted to make a connection to your presentation, and one of the principles I think that you talked about was about contradiction and paradox. Is that correct? So one of the guiding values, can we embrace paradox and contradiction, and connecting to what Marquis was saying earlier about the importance of slowing down in this work, which reminded me of some of the people I interviewed talking about white people getting really enthusiastic and then fading out, right? Because there's not quick solutions, there's not easy answers as part of that phenomenon, I think. But so on the one hand, I would say this is really urgent work. We need to really be working hard on this, and we need to slow down. So that's the paradox that I wanted to offer to connect some threads.
Yes, I like that. We need to slow down very quickly. And I guess I will just add one more sentence, knowing that others may want to chime in. I guess the other one sentence I would add would be more questions and fewer solutions.
That's a tough one to follow. 'Cause I agree, don't have any answers. But I think that the potential that these conversations have is pretty far reaching, with quite capacity to be impactful for decades to come. I think whatever coming up with the idea for me of an accessible toolkit across a range of folks that I've lived and worked with for anti-racist work, if that happens successfully, if I'm part of it, whoever takes that on, I think also just answers a really huge methodological question in the field of disability research, in the field of justice research generally, which is how to include and how to represent and reflect. I love Joe's statement about this intellectualizing of these conversations and tensions, what book to read, who's saying it the best, who has the longest list of publications and the most authority to speak. And I think the more we think about the questions we're asking right now, coming up with resources and materials that you all have mentioned and that we're thinking about, the more successfully we move away from that thought process or an attachment to knowledge needing to look a certain kind of way to count as real work, and moving towards inclusive and accessible method and platform for voices that, within intellectual disability, within race, within a whole lot of indigenous spaces, offers a huge context for what a lot of people in research are figuring out, how to include, how to reflect difference, how to do so without speaking for. That feels very exciting and interesting. So I will stop there with just more points, no answers.
Thanks. I'm curious if we will have a actionable handbook which holds lots of questions in it if we meet for the next ICSA conference. For now, I'm closing the session. There will be for everyone on site dinner in half an hour, and for 1 hour, I think, and in 2 hours, the next sessions, respective workshops, gonna start at 8 p.m. So with this little outlook, thanks again to everyone presenting, participating, taking care for tech issues. Thank you.